Okay, picture this. A book so unimaginably massive, it literally takes two fully grown adults just to heave it off the table. And get this, it was written entirely by hand in a single, perfectly unwavering script. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a colossal medieval mystery. We're going to uncover the actual historical reality behind one of the most infamous and honestly misunderstood manuscripts to ever exist. I am, of course, talking about the Codex Gigas, or, as history has affectionately and somewhat terrifyingly dubbed it, the Devil's Bible. If you've ever been fascinated by how real history gets twisted into these wild supernatural legends, well, you are in the exact right place.
So, the big question right off the bat, did one lone monk actually make a desperate midnight pact with the devil? I mean, the legend is intense. It says a 13th century monk named Herman the Recluse was facing a truly horrific punishment. He was sentenced to be walled up alive. Absolutely terrifying, right? So, to save his own skin, he promises his superior something impossible. He says he'll write a book containing all of human knowledge in a single night. Well, as the midnight hour crept closer, reality hit. The task was impossible. So, the story goes, he prayed. But not to God. He prayed to Lucifer. We're going to explore exactly why people bought into this terrifying tale for centuries, and more importantly, what the real story actually is.
To really understand this, we need to set the scene. The Codex Gigas originally emerged from the super quiet, shadowy halls of a medieval Bohemian monastery in Podlajica. Just put yourself in that setting for a second. You've got dim, flickering candlelight, the endless, repetitive scratch of a quill on parchment, the heavy smell of ink in the air, and just one solitary figure, a guy embarking on a project so profoundly ambitious that it completely defies normal human limits. This whole monumental task kicked off way back in the early 13th century. Now remember, we are talking about an era long before the printing press was even a thought. Every single letter, every brightly illuminated initial, every intricate little border, it all had to be painstakingly crafted by hand. Keeping that historical context in mind is absolutely vital here because it really drives home the sheer, mind-boggling impossibility of what this book represents. And that brings us to the first major clue behind its dark reputation, its literal, physical enormity. This thing is a beast. The Codex Gigas is nearly 36 inches tall, 20 inches wide, and weighs a staggering 165 pounds. To put that into perspective, they had to use the skins of roughly 160 donkeys and calves just to create the vellum pages for this. Staring at this physical marvel, you can kind of see why medieval onlookers were stunned. They simply couldn't fathom that a single human being could produce this behemoth all on their own.
So you take that immense physical weight, and you combine it with the impossible speed at which the legend claimed it was written. Well, to a superstitious mind, that was all the proof they needed. Supernatural intervention had to be at play. The medieval logic here was actually pretty straightforward. They thought, look, if a mortal man couldn't physically harvest, prep, and write this entire volume by himself in a normal lifetime, he must have had demonic assistance. It just made sense to them.
Naturally, the surrounding whispers quickly spread way beyond the walls of the scriptorium. Monks, local villagers, basically everyone let their imaginations run completely wild into the dark. It is fascinating and honestly a little bit unsettling, right? It just goes to show how quickly the human mind rushes to fill the gaps in our understanding with the supernatural whenever we're faced with something we just can't explain. But wait, because the actual contents of the book? They only threw more fuel onto that superstitious fire. Inside, there's this incredibly unsettling juxtaposition. On one hand, you have the entire Latin Vulgate Bible, historical chronicles, and standard medical texts, but they are placed right alongside mystical incantations for exorcisms, and the undeniable centerpiece of the whole shebang? A massive, brightly colored, 19-inch portrait of the devil himself, just sitting right there, ironically placed opposite to depictions of the heavenly city. That single, terrifying drawing, which features this green-faced demon with red claws wearing of all things an ermine loincloth, is exactly what fueled centuries of fear. I mean, think about it. Why on earth would a devout Benedictine monk draw the devil in such vivid, imposing detail? To the medieval mind, that illustration wasn't just art. It was the ultimate confession. It was the absolute visual proof they needed to confirm that dark, midnight pact. Now, this massive tome didn't just stay hidden away in some dark, dusty cellar. Not at all. Over the centuries, it literally survived fires, plagues, and wars. At one point, it was even looted as prized war booty by the Swedish army during the 30 Years' War back in 1648. So it carried its dark, demonic reputation all across Europe for hundreds of years. That is, until it finally came to rest securely in the modern, climate-controlled halls of the Czech National Library. And it's here, under the careful, objective scrutiny of modern paleographers, that our story takes a turn. We pivot from myth to actual science. By stripping away all the ghost stories and those centuries of whispers, modern scholars have finally been able to look closely at the real evidence. We're talking ink composition, handwriting uniformity, and the actual human mechanics required to create a masterpiece of this scale.
So what did they find? Well, historians have completely flipped the narrative. When they analyzed the text, they discovered something that is, honestly, perhaps even more shocking than a demonic pact. The handwriting? It remains perfectly consistent from the very first page to the absolute last. Think about that. There are no signs of aging, no signs of illness, and no evidence of changing scribes. Actually, let that sink in. It points to a single author working with unbreakable, ironclad discipline. The true marvel they discovered isn't supernatural magic at all. It's a genuinely awe-inspiring display of extreme human endurance. Get this. Scholars estimate that just recreating the calligraphy, and that is without even factoring in those detailed illustrations or the massive amount of time spent prepping all that parchment, would take over 20 to 30 years of non-stop daily writing. 20 to 30 years! It requires a kind of intense spiritual devotion that is, frankly, profoundly difficult for us to even grasp today.
So rather than some sudden, magical creation born out of a frantic midnight bargain with the devil, the Codex is the result of methodical, agonizingly dedicated work. It was produced under the incredibly strict, isolating rules of monastic life, and experts believe it was likely an act of lifelong penance. The real magic driving that quill? It wasn't demonic assistance, it was just extreme, unyielding human discipline.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. What if the true devilish aspect of the Codex Gigas was simply the agonizing, lifetime commitment required to write it? I mean, perhaps the sheer willpower to spend one's entire existence spent over a single colossal task is actually far more terrifying and undeniably more awe-inspiring than any midnight pact in the dark. So keep that in mind the next time you encounter an impossible myth. It might just be human nature at its most extreme. Thanks for exploring this historical detective story with me today.